Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. We appreciate it. We're glad you're here with us. We have sat down today with a guest we've had before, Craig Morley. Now, Craig is to use a phrase, world famous. But while Craig holds a lot of interesting positions, today he's here talking to us just as Craig, just appraiser to appraiser. So no, nothing official here. This is a wise, experienced appraiser, and we're going to ask him some questions and get his straight take on stuff. Craig, how are you?
I'm doing well, Tim. Thank you. How are you doing?
Oh, we seem to be doing fine down here in Florida. It's just another day in paradise. Well, Craig, we have spoken off air about numerous things, and we have decided that some are important and some are not terribly important. So give us an idea of what's on your mind. What is it that you've been thinking about, especially from a standpoint of someone who's been here for a long time, who's appraised all sorts of properties over literally 3 states? And given that background, given that experience, we're in the position to learn from you. So what's been on your mind recently?
Well, Tim, it's been interesting over the past couple of months, and I think many may know that I had recently been on a interview, or at least a presentation, where the Brookings Institute had their scholar discuss a little bit about his findings with this results that he's found with significant differences in home values between what he characterizes as black neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods. And that was an interesting conversation because we have some interesting challenges because I suspect the reality is that there are differences in neighborhood values from one area to the next. And it's oftentimes difficult to identify what are the characteristics in a neighborhood that drive value. And one of the interesting things that had come up in the discussion with dealing with this was the concern that neighborhoods with lower property values from an assessment perspective, and the allegation is that hey, if the assessor is assessing values lower in a minority neighborhood, there are less tax dollars available to support some of the community services and things, and that may be a systemic problem with values that it perpetuates maybe the lower values because you don't have the community services. Well, right now, and probably for the past, 20, 25 years, I've served as a hearing officer in our local county assessor's office. And as a hearing officer, we're essentially adjudicating between the county assessor who's saying, we think that the value is this, and the property owner, the taxpayer, who's coming in and saying, oh, no, it's that. And as hearing officer, we're sworn in, and we basically hear the two cases and make a determination on what the value ought to be. And one of the things that's interesting is that there's a lot of misunderstandings about how that whole property tax thing works. And I think maybe some of our academics that are, suggesting that because lower property values result in lower total tax collected from a tax district may adversely impact the funds that are available to support a community. So why don't we talk for just a little bit about how this whole thing works? And of course, there's differences from one state to the next and county to the next, but in general, there's general principles that I think would apply that might be of interest. So let's talk for a minute about that, and then we can swerve into a few other things.
Well, Craig, let me ask you a question here now. Okay, so all of a sudden, if somebody walks into neighborhood X and says, "Okay, well, all right, let's say these properties are more valuable." Well, isn't that basically saying nothing more than, okay, let's make the properties more expensive? And then doesn't that just raise the taxes? And if there's nothing else that's going up other than the taxes, how is that going to help the people in that neighborhood?
See, and that's the interesting thing that we find. Property tax, there's a lot of places that feel like property tax is an unjust tax, but the theory behind having market value as the basis for establishing a property tax is that people who have more expensive properties pay more in taxes. And if I'm using market value as the basis to establish that, then presumably the people who have the most expensive real estate are those that are paying the most, and those people who may be underprivileged or have lower property values are paying less. And so while there's issues within, philosophical issues on whether that's an appropriate way to distribute the tax burden, it's a pretty efficient way in terms of saying, okay, I'm going to go in and determine values in an area, and then the residents of that area are going to pay their share of the tax burden based on the value of their property. And so what we find is that in concept, this idea that, well, gee, if my home's in a neighborhood where property values are higher and I'm paying more, does that neighborhood get a proportionate share of the tax revenue in their community or in that area? And the way that many of the taxing entities work is they basically go in, we're looking at it the wrong way. Most of the time what happens is that those people who are entitled to get money from revenue, from property tax, they have a budget, and they will go in at the appropriate time in the year and say, okay, this is how much it costs me to provide the services that I have, and this is the amount that I need to be able to do that. And so once that budget has gone through the budgeting process and they have the budget approved, they now come to the tax assessor and say, Mr. Tax Assessor, I need to raise $1 billion to cover my budget. What's the taxable value of the taxes in this tax district or in these respective tax districts? And essentially what happens is your tax rate is established based on the amount of money they need to raise based on taxable value. And taxable value is oftentimes, and it depends on where you're at, but taxable value is oftentimes different than market value because you've got properties that are owned by charitable organizations that may not have any taxable value. You may have exemptions and things that prevent, that they get discounts. Oftentimes there's some programs available for seniors or others, and you get into places like California where they go in and put caps on the amount. But at the end of the day, there's the market value becomes the framework or the basis that the tax burden is distributed, and the idea that a neighborhood will get more because the property taxes are higher in a particular area may not necessarily be the case. In fact, in our areas, it's never the case. It's really, there's only a few places that have right to get the property tax, and that's usually your school districts and a few other places. And so it's just not the way that oftentimes people seem to think it is. And as a hearing officer, I've had more than a few cases where taxpayers come in and they're just upset that at the whole system, and they want to complain about everything, and it makes for an interesting conversation as we try to get back on track and deal with the issues at hand.
No, I think you and I both agree that while it is up to the appraiser to form a value opinion, it is up to the appraiser to measure the market and form a value conclusion about the properties in the market, that the appraiser herself does not create value. The appraiser merely synthesizes an opinion out of the market data there are, correct?
That's what we're supposed to do. We occasionally get some of these anecdotal stories, and there's one in the New York Times not long ago where presumably somebody had, one person had appraised it low and the other one had appraised it high, and there's some allegations that it was because all of the imagery and so forth associated with race had been removed. We don't know the information about that, but and the reality is that appraisers are people, and you have different levels of competency and ability, and you get some people that don't, you know, that as they develop their opinions, that they may not correspond with one of their peers. But rarely does it have anything to do with the ethnicity of the people involved. I guess conceivably it could happen from time to time, but I've never seen it happen. And I think more often than not, it's the trying to collect reliable data, analyze it, and develop opinions that make sense. And more often than not, the problem is trying to figure out the quality of your comp data and try to figure out what is the quality and condition of your comparable sales. We usually have the subject figured out pretty good. The trick is trying to figure out the quality and condition and characteristics associated with the comps, and that's where sometimes I think we run into problems.
Speaking of running into problems, I was on the phone recently with an appraiser in a northwestern state. I won't say which one. And the appraiser indicated that the family, all involved in appraising, back to the grandparents, had been there forever, you know, since literally the 50s. And for the first time in their lives, in this relatively rural northwestern state, they're seeing license plates from New York. And there are people from the eastern U.S., especially the northeastern U.S., who admittedly, they have no compunctions whatsoever against saying, yeah, we want out. You know, we want to get back to America. And they're moving to relatively small towns in what have traditionally been rural areas. And what they're doing is they're bringing a lot of money with them, and they're pushing up the prices of real estate. And appraisers are looking at a situation where a house comes on the market, and within 48 hours, there have been 6 all-cash offers, each of them higher than the other. And this is what the appraiser was telling us, that the family has offices all over the state. And even because some of the offices are located near the borders of other states, they do business in other states as well. So they've got people coming in with a lot of money. There's a limited supply of real estate. Those coming in with the money are bidding up the price of houses in the neighborhood. And the appraisers are saying, what do I do? The definition of market value does not allow for this. I'm sitting here looking at what should be a situation where builders are flocking to buy land and build houses because there's demand for them and prices are going up. But the builders know there's a speculative component, and therefore they don't want to buy a lot of land and have 15 or 20 houses up sitting there sucking up interest and then have the market collapse. So, you know, this is a situation, Craig, that the definition of market value doesn't anticipate. This is a situation in which highest and best use is difficult to apply, but yet there are people out there buying houses, and appraisers are killing deals, and brokers are all bent out of shape. Any advice?
Move. No, we're running into similar situations as you get people leaving a lot of your urban areas. It's been interesting to see. We've had a number of people leave the San Francisco Bay Area because they still don't have the stuff opened up in they still don't have the businesses they can't go to work. and they're working from home, and you're in a tiny little apartment or house that is expensive, and they're going, gee, if I'm doing all my stuff by way of Zoom, maybe I ought to just go to the suburbs and get something that's a lot cheaper. Quality of life is better. I can actually go outside and let the kids play at the park without getting arrested. And so you're seeing a lot of these people leave, and they're coming to our area, and we're having the same kinds of things. In fact, it's interesting, Tim. We're probably not very smart, because we started construction of a new office building for ourselves, and we were in talking to the suppliers, and they're saying right now that lumber is in huge demand and very short supply. In fact, we're having they put tariffs on lumber coming in from Canada, and there's a very limited supply, simply because a lot of the Canadian workers aren't working because of some of the COVID restrictions. U.S. production has dropped somewhat because of some of the COVID restrictions. And so you've got builders that are basically trying to store lumber. And so the suppliers were telling us that they won't even deliver a lumber package to a property unless there is a foundation that's poured in place and it's ready to go vertical, because you've got some of these folks out hoarding this stuff, and lumber prices have more than doubled in the past few weeks. Well, in the past month or so. And so the question that you ask yourself, is that speculative? Is it going to last? What's going to happen? What does that do to value? And how does that affect property values? And the reality is that it does affect the acquisition cost for new construction, which filters all the way down through to the resale of existing homes. Now, the reality is, if you and I knew how to accurately forecast what's going to happen, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. But the reality is an appraisal is a snapshot in time, and we have to accurately reflect what is going on with the market and explain to the client. Usually, if it's for a purchase or a refinance, it's a GSE and a lender, what's going on, so that they can accurately assess the risk associated with not only that property, but the market area in which that property is located. And so I think you pretty well you've got, from my perspective, I think you have to understand your market, use the best data that you've got, and develop your opinions on the basis of that data. And if it comes in a little bit short, well, I can only go with the data that I've got. And but at the same time, with new construction, the single biggest problem that we run into is that we usually don't have great new construction data. And so trying to use 10, 15-year-old homes as comparable sales is really hard to do and end up with anything that's meaningful.
Craig, let's talk about state enforcement relative to this issue. Now, so everybody knows you were on the Utah board. You still consult with the Utah board. Your son, Jeff, is the chair of the Utah board. Now, obviously, there are going to be complaints filed, not only with Utah, but with other boards, relative to, appraisers. Well, they did a lousy job because my house has to be worth $450,000 because I had an offer of $450,000, but the appraiser appraised it for only $410,000. So the appraiser got it wrong, and I want the appraisal board to punish somebody just because it's Thursday and I had lasagna for lunch. And appraisers are going to be they're going to be brought up before their state boards. They're going to be brought up before their professional societies for this. Any thoughts on what appraisers can do to prepare themselves for these situations, or even more ideally, what they can do to avoid these situations?
Well, we once I was talking with one of our state investigators, regulators, and he said, if people would just be nice, they would avoid 60 to 70% of the complaints that are filed against them. And yeah, I think there's some truth to that. A lot of times as appraisers, we don't want to be bothered with a homeowner who's upset. And I don't. I mean, I don't like getting the unhappy phone call with somebody telling me what an idiot I am because I didn't concur with what they believe. But the reality is I hear stories all the time where somebody calls in and wants to have a conversation with this idiotic appraiser who clearly doesn't know anything and has appraised their property too low and is messing things up. And the appraiser, obviously, we kind of react when we get somebody that's unhappy. Perhaps we react the same way, and so we are not as professional as we should be. And the position that I've found that seems to work the best is that when somebody calls and they're unhappy, number one, they're probably not my client. I probably can't have that conversation. And rather than just say, hey, I can't talk to you and hang up the phone, I say, listen, I can appreciate your frustration. My client is the only person I can really talk to about this without permission. Why don't you have them send me an email confirmation that allows me to visit with you about my findings on your appraisal? And if they'll do that, I'd be happy to explain where we're coming from. And hey, if there's some information that's relevant to the valuation, let's take a look at it. And 90% of the time, that diffuses it. I'm not being rude to them. I'm trying to be as courteous as I can. And the lender says, listen, you can't be talking to these people. Don't call the appraiser again. But it doesn't cause that adversarial relationship. And if you do have that conversation with these people, just oftentimes explaining the reality of, I've got to use data. It's not simply my opinion. We've got development standards. I've got reporting standards. I've got people that review this stuff. Nobody cares what I think unless I have the supporting data to back my opinion up. And so I think realistically, the best thing that you can do is be nice. And the second thing that you need to do, and I think that this is probably one of the biggest mistakes that we as appraisers make, is we think it's all about the value. And clearly the value is a big deal. But the thing that I think we forget is that these appraisals are a risk analysis tool. The secondary markets are using it to develop the property, decide to make a loan on a property based on the relative risk. And having an accurate neighborhood description and a reliable site description and supporting your opinions on quality and condition. I can't tell you how many times I hear people say, well, I'm just rating everything average because that way I don't run into a conflict. If I use this comp again, I don't have to worry about how I rated it last time. In fact, it was kind of interesting. A few years ago, I was in a meeting with Fannie Mae, and one of the officials there says, I wished we could get people to actually apply these quality and condition ratings properly, because they had a brand new home, and it was a C4 Q4 as a brand new home. And clearly whoever's doing it is just mechanically going through and applying these things. And I think that when we default to some kind of a mechanical process in doing the appraisal, we find ourselves more likely to be in trouble because we aren't doing the kind of analysis that we really ought to be doing.
Craig, from a standpoint, analysis, let's take a look at that for a few minutes. From a standpoint of analysis, and this is going back to my earlier question a little bit, we have data that says, okay, yes, there have been 5 legitimate offers on this list. It's listed at 300, and the offers are coming in at 350 and 360, et cetera, and they're legitimate. And obviously the brokers don't have to give out data on those offers. Technically, that's confidential to them, but sometimes they do. And you're happy with the fact that, to you, as nearly as you can tell, the offers appear legitimate. So, from a standpoint, what are, excuse me, what are our ethical obligations relative to analyzing these offers that, quite frankly, may have a speculative component in them?
You know, Tim, I think it's important to convey the information to the client. You know, say, hey, there were 5 offers, and the one that was finally accepted may or may not have been the highest. Oftentimes, what we'll find is that if we have an offer that has a strong borrower. I was talking to an agent. Well, I was out doing a VA appraisal, and the seller told me that, yeah, we had multiple offers, but I'm a vet. The guy who was buying the property was a vet. I selected that offer because I wanted to help the veteran. The offer was more than the list price, but it wasn't the highest offer. And I thought, you know, that's useful information to help my client understand that there's a lot of demand for this property, and the motivation wasn't purely financial in terms of the selection of the offer that they ultimately ended up accepting. To me, though, the most critical component, and I think it's maybe something that as appraisers we're so focused on the comparable sales that we forget inventory is a huge component of driving value. And so when I'm going in and looking at my market data, and listings are part of that market data, how many properties are for sale? What's the inventory looking like? And in many parts of the country, the inventory is very small. And so we know that I've got good demand, I've got small inventory, a small supply. Property prices are likely to go up. And so I think, you know, as we reconcile our final opinions of value, going in and talking about the inventory, the listings, the competing properties that are there, I think helps to paint a more reliable picture, so that I can say, yeah, I went to the top end of the range because there's just nothing available. Now, the day may come when that changes. In fact, it probably will. And if, you know, we don't see some changes in some of the economic situations in a few of these urban centers, you're going to start seeing foreclosures and things that might change the inventory situation. But I think the only thing you can do is report what's on the ground when you're doing the appraisal, and make your best judgment on the basis of what you have today.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is, just like we've been trained and educated, we go with the data that we have. We look at all of it. We reject the irrelevant data, and we analyze the relevant data. And then in our final value opinion, we weight it. We weight it to determine how much it's going to affect the value opinion. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the way we've been trained, and it's the way I think that makes the most sense, is to look at the situation on the ground. I oftentimes will hear people saying, well, I don't want to get too crazy on this new construction stuff because it's not going to be worth more, or it's going to be worth less in a few years. And I look at that and say, well, that's a stupid way to look at it, because the reality is why would anybody ever buy a new car if it's good? Because I mean, the one thing you absolutely know, that a used car isn't going to be worth the same as a new car. So why are new cars not never worth what people pay for them? Or is it just a reality that I'm going to accept? I'm going to take a new home versus a used home because I want the warranties, I don't want the hassles, and I like new. It was kind of funny, years ago, my wife and I were having this conversation, and we were talking about something on a home that we were looking to try to do, and she comes up with this little statement. She says, you know, my favorite color is new. And for a lot of people, that's true. You'll get some people that will never buy a new car because they don't want to take the front end depreciation. And you'll get some people who will never buy a used house or a used car because they don't want the hassles associated with the problems that arise on old stuff. And so I think the reality is that we have to take into consideration the fact that if people are buying new stuff and they're building new stuff, there's demand for it, and you have to appraise it as though it's a new house, not what it might be worth in a year or two from now when it's a used house.
Oh, Craig, as we wrap up, and this has been great. This has been very enlightening about what's going on in current markets. Is there anything else pressing on your mind you think we need to know about?
You know, Tim, I think the thing that we have to be careful of when we write these reports is make sure that we're not cloning too much stuff. I can't tell you how many times that people find themselves in trouble because they cloned some old report and forgot to go clean it up and make it relevant to the current situation. And it's easy. You know, I've appraised the home in this neighborhood a year or two ago. I don't want to have to go write all of the new stuff for it, and so I'm going to copy a lot of this stuff over, and that can really cause you some problems. I some years ago I was involved in a litigation case where an appraiser had cloned an old appraisal, and it was clear that they'd cloned the old appraisal because we were coming into 2009, and in 2009 the market wasn't doing so good, and this appraisal, the allegation is that appraised this property too high, and a person had made a decision on the basis of that appraisal. And if you read the report, it was talking about how jobs are great, that property values are going up, this economy couldn't be any better, when in fact it was in free fall. And it was clear what had happened is the appraiser had cloned the information from an appraisal that they had done in that area a few years before. You know, and if you would have done an appraisal in 2006, all of those things would have been accurate. In 2009, they weren't. And so the neighborhood values and neighborhood trends and all those kinds of things were wrong. And it just added to the other problems that existed within the report. And so my advice is make sure that you don't get in such a hurry to try to become efficient that we forget to make sure that your report is relevant given the characteristics of the market today, and that we are using information that is relevant today, because you know things change, and we need to make sure that our data reflects that.
Craig, are you in the position to share with us what happened to that particular appraiser?
Well, they were going after his E&O. And again, this is one of these situations where listings become critical. This property ended up being appraised for a couple $100,000 more than it had been listed before a few months prior. And they ended up settling out of court, but it cost his E&O company a couple $100,000. And the person's no longer an appraiser. I think they decided that they couldn't get E&O after that, and it just wasn't worth it. And part of it was because they weren't looking at the listing inventory. They weren't looking at the market trends, and they certainly didn't communicate that very well in the report. And so when this person who bought the property and discovered that they may have paid a little too much for it, ended up deciding that they wanted to take some action, that was the net result.
Interesting. Craig, thank you. Let me thank you again for a fascinating interview. Let me thank you for your background and your wisdom. If somebody needs to get in touch with you to ask you for some advice or to consult with you on areas in which you are an acknowledged expert, how can they do that? Looks like we lost Craig. Well, that's okay. The joys of the internet. So when Craig finally comes back on, I'll tell him what happened. And Craig will send you his best because he is that kind of a gentleman. And so until the next time we get to sit down with each other, thank you.
There we go.
There's Craig. Or maybe there isn't Craig.
All right.
You there?
Yeah. Well,
The joys
I'm
of
here
live
now.
recording,
It
right?
kind of went blank, and so yeah. Well, I think we got most of it, so hopefully
I
it's
think we
okay.
got most of it. So anyway, everybody, thank you for listening. I appreciate it very much. It's always good to be with you. And until next time, we're clear. Thanks.
Yeah.